Okay, so I'm Jim Zarzana. For those of you that don't know me, I am a retired professor, actually, of English, not history, at the university here in town. My wife and daughter and I came to Marshall in 1989, and I retired from full-time teaching about 3 years ago to pretty much devote my time to writing, hence I keep giving you all the plugs about my writing. But prior to 2014, several of us at the university and the library here started this idea of doing a commemoration series of lectures tied into World War I. World War I was 1914 to 1918. There are significant events that happened in 1919. So we plan these series of lectures to go from 2014 to 2019. And so usually we get about 3 or 4 lectures per year, and they're held here and on the campus. So I did this presentation yesterday on campus at noon. That gives you an idea. And we've done everything from major battles. I know Mr. Purrington did one on the beginning of the war. And so this one is about the Great Influenza. Now, I call it the war everyone lost for a very important reason. The war killed about 5 million people. Almost all of them were soldiers. There was not yet long-distance bombing the way you would have in World War II. And of course, the end of World War II was at least in the Pacific, with the 2 atomic bombs. And so in World War II, you had many more civilian casualties. But to put the influenza into perspective, the fighting in the war started July, August of 14 and went till November 11th of 1918. Hence, we celebrate in the United States Veterans Day. In Europe, it's Armistice Day, or in England, it's Armistice Day. But over that almost 4.5-year period, 5 million people died. The Great Influenza hits in the spring and summer of 1918, and there are deaths all the way through the spring of 19, so maybe a year or a period. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 million people died. Just to give you a perspective, many sites will say 50 million, and in the course of this evening, I'll tell you why I got up to 100 million, okay? So first of all, a little basic biology. I don't see any bio professors out there. If I'm wrong, correct me afterwards. But there's a difference between a bacteria and bacteria and viruses. And I have a pointer. There, what you have here is the actual a salmonella bacteria. And you know you can get salmonella from food poisoning, chocolate that's gone bad, stuff like it. It does not stop you from eating chocolate, but that is one way that it gets passed around. This is a bacterium, and this is a healthy cell. It's taking over and destroying a healthy cell. Now, this is a virus, a rotavirus, and actually this is about 50 times smaller than that. They're not in any way in scale. And there was no way to get a picture of this until the 1950s, when scientists developed electron microscopes. And actually, this even says enhanced, because they really can't see it. They have to kind of do a little computer graphics to sort of figure it out. So these you can see pretty well. And this you're kind of guessing. So in 1918, when people were dying, in some cases in 12 hours, they could see these things in a microscope. They had no way of knowing what these were. And so they assumed it was some sort of bacterial infection. And of course, they had no antibiotics at this time. But that just hurt in trying to understand what was killing people. Now, in 1918, the microscope could not see a virus, as I said. The common microscope of 1918 was roughly what you have in your high school lab facility right now. Electron microscopes came about in the 50s, and many researchers, as I said, in 1918 assumed what they saw in people who were dying when they saw these bacteria running amok was that that's what was killing them. In many cases it was, but the virus set up the opportunistic bacteria. Okay, you can't see this very well because I picked the background of this, the PowerPoint before I found this slide. There won't be a quiz, so don't worry about it. Basically what this shows, and you can go to Wiki and find this, that's where I found this. But bacteria infections, this is a body. I don't know if you can see the outline of a human body there. But this is all the ways that a bacteria can make you sick or kill you, and this is all the way that a virus can. And guess what? They're almost identical, right? They're different names for different things. But the only thing I could see that was way different is that a bacteria can screw up your sinuses more easily than a virus, okay? But they can make you sick in every part of your body identically. All right, now, is it a cold or is it a flu? And they both come from a virus. Here are the symptoms: sneezing, headache, sore throat. You see that? And if you have a cold, it's usually in your throat and your nose. You don't get a severe headache unless you get a complication in your sinuses. You probably don't get a very high fever. You get minor aches, and you've all had a cold, and most of us struggle through it. We take a few over-the-counter things and go on and use a lot of Kleenex. And it usually goes away after a while. The flu hits differently. Same thing, comes from a virus, but it hits more in the lungs. And a cold comes on very slowly. All of you have said, oh, I'm coming down with a cold. And you have a couple days of knowing, well, there might be a day where I can't go into work, my throat will hurt too much, but you can kind of plan on it. Whereas a virus just comes on like gangbusters. You get a fever right away, you get headaches, you get body aches, and the severest flus, it's the coughing and the chest, and you feel it in here. My wife, Marianne, and I both in the last couple years have lost dear friends who were older and had complicated immune systems. One man had diabetes, and he got the influenza and brought on heart condition, and it was, he was gone. So the influenza usually takes the elderly and often takes the people who already have some kind of compromised immune system, okay? Whoops, that's the pointer. I want this guy. Now, the influenza hits every year. It's a virus. It mutates. They grow very easily, and so and they grow in other animals. And so humans we get influenza every year. We talk about flu season. How many got our influenza shot? Did you all get your influenza? Raise your hands. All you young people, yeah, start getting it. Don't play with fire here. Okay. So in an average year, and Dr. Laporte saw me do this at noon yesterday, and he approved this, so I'm not off scientifically. But in an average year in the United States, about 34,000 people will die. What's our population? About 350 million, something like that, 340 million. So that's a very, very small percentage dying of the influenza. Okay, keep that 34,000 in mind in a bit. During an average flu season, 12 to 56,000 Americans will die. Come on in, their seats are up here. You can see the hospital rate. If it's very bad, you can see a lot more people going to the hospital. And you can see about how many people get sick. Has this happened at Marshall High? There's so many people with the flu, they close down for a couple days. They just say there's too many people sick, the faculty are sick, the students are sick. I know.
Well, we never shut down, but yeah, it's been
Yeah. And sometimes that's just what you have to do because it's just going to pass through people. But even when there's a lot of people hospitalized, we don't expect young people, age 5 to 55, to die from influenza. It can happen. It does happen. We don't expect that. Now, this gives you an idea of the great influenza. Now notice, I keep calling it the great influenza. It's also called the Spanish flu. But after tonight, you're never going to call it that again. Okay, we'll discuss why that is. There's two errors on this chart. The first is that they say 50 million, and I'm thinking, and other researchers have said it's closer to 100 million, and by the end of tonight, I'll show you why where we get that number. And they call it the Spanish flu, which again, after tonight, you're not going to do. Most of you don't remember 1968, but the Hong Kong flu hit 3 million people worldwide. And that created a sensation. 3 million people worldwide. They're going, holy moly, what is this? In 1957, very few of us would remember that, the Asian flu hit 1 million worldwide. You know, and so even if this number is accurate, between 1 million, 3 million, 50 million, you know, what was going on? At the swine flu in 2009, 429 deaths. But it still scared the medical community, because if this thing gets cranking and there's no stop, because influenza spreads very easily. And there's another chart I have where the death rate of the swine flu in 2009 was something like 65 or 70%, which is huge, huge, worse than the great influenza. So, what made 1918 so special? Did I miss a? Nope. The yearly influenza will kill the very young and the very old, as I said, and those with a compromised immune system. The yearly influenza can be more or less severe depending on several factors, including the guess that has to go on about the vaccine. There was no vaccine in 1918. But for the last 20 years or so, there's been a vaccine, and they guess what is the influenza that's coming about 9 months ahead, so they can produce this stuff to have it ready to give it to us, that it will be effective. This year, they didn't guess particularly well. There's an influenza going around. We're not going to call it the Australian influenza, but that's what it's being called. And it's particularly virulent. And part of the reason is that they guessed wrong, because they were making the protective antibodies that we all got in our flu shot months ahead. And then when it hit in Australia, it was slightly different. And so it doesn't protect as well. It protects some, but not as well. So, why is this so crazy? Now, just look at the dotted line. I know that made you all look at the other line, but the dotted line here, I should make a Marshall High student explain how a chart and graph works, because I know they know this. But you see what this is? This is per deaths per thousand. You know, you see up to 2,500. And this is the age of the people dying. Now, we're just looking at the dotted line. This is why I wanted the pointer. You're just looking at the dotted line. And you'll notice, if you're 4 years or younger and you get the influenza, you have a high risk of dying. Your lungs are not fully developed. You don't have the strongest heart, because a little tiny heart. You are not really ready to fight off this very, very serious disease. You get a high fever, it can affect your brain. And notice, though, you get to be 5 years old till you're about 55 or 60. You really are in a group that's going to survive the flu. You're going to feel terrible. You're going to take, you know, your Tylenol and you put your feet up and moan because your body aches. And you're going to cough like crazy, but you're going to survive. More than likely, you're going to survive. Now, this is prior to 1917, but this is pretty much the same chart you would get today. Then, as you get a little bit older, over 65, you see this starts to go up. And of course, the elderly, because they have a weakened immune system, their hearts are weakened, are more than likely going to die when you get your average yearly influenza. 1918, same chart, look at the death rate. The solid line, boom, boom, and up. People from the mid-teens to about 45 were the highest instances of death. These are people that in any given time should be our healthiest citizens. And they were the ones that were dying. And notice, they weren't just dying, but look at the death rate per thousand, that many. I mean, you've got to be over 75 to get the same death rate. It was just shocking. They just did not know what was going on. And of course, as we'll explain in a minute, the war made it that much worse. Now, anytime you've got something going on, kids are going to make up a song. This jingle will be in your head now for the next couple days. I had a little bird. Its name was Enza. I opened up the window and in flew Enza, because it was hitting the kids. It was hitting the young people. And it was just so shocking what was going on. So, 1918, why was it so different? In a word, a couple words, we still don't really know. They did autopsies. They took lung tissue and other tissue from dead soldiers. They preserved them the best they could, but this is 1918, and they did not have the same type of medical science that we would have today. And looking at those slides that they've preserved for over 100 years, they really can't determine what that particular virus exactly is. One of the books I'll talk about at the end, there was a race to find cadavers that were buried in the permafrost in the 1990s, but it didn't work out. They didn't find a perfect specimen where the influenza virus was still perfectly intact. So there's a lot of guesswork going on. But we know a lot about influenza. This will not make you happy. We share N1 or H1. H1s and H5s are particularly bad. We share them with cats and tigers, cattle, etc. But the thing to watch out for is we share a whole boatload with birds, avian. What's missing here is turkeys, but they belong there, and we'll talk about turkeys in a minute. But all of this, domesticated chicken, quail, wildfowl, domesticated geese and wild geese, turkeys, can all have an influenza, carry an influenza that may not kill them, that can easily be transmitted to humans. Swines as well, pigs as well, can carry an influenza that can be easily transmitted to humans, and it may not kill the pig, but it might make us very, very sick. Now, the arrow here goes to humans. If I draw on this chart, I would have had the arrow go here, because this three-way circle is part of what created the great influenza. Because the viruses, is that my next slide? Yes. Avian, bird, swine, and humans. Viruses go back and forth all the time. Some can make us sick, some we don't even notice, some we've already had that type of virus before and our body, fights it. But this we know about viruses, and they didn't know all of this in 1918. They change rapidly. They're looking for new hosts, and once they find a new host, they mix and match. Their DNA has only 6 strands of something. I'm not a scientist, but 6 is very primitive, very simple, and so they can mix and match very easily. Before we know it, one aspect of a virus, say the ability to spread via droplets in the air, this is why we cough like this, right, or like this. The ability to spread through the air might get picked up from the chicken strand and move to the pigs and then move to us. So they're constantly changing their DNA, and suddenly that virus may have something in it that humans have never encountered, and therefore it makes us sick. It's also worse when we're exhausted, because systemic stress makes it easier for us to get sick. This is why we tell our high school children, get some rest, don't pull an all-nighter, you're going to get sick, and they don't believe you, and yet they go to school and they all get sick. Viruses, I'm going to quote a gentleman, his name is Oxford, just like the university, Dr. John Oxford. He's the leading English virologist, guy who studies all this. And he says, look, viruses live to do just a couple things. They live to find a host, that'd be like us or a pig or a chicken, to replicate and die. That's all they do, Some of us like to write books, some of us, have hobbies. No, viruses don't. They find a host, they replicate, they die. That's it. They don't even go out for chocolate ice cream. I mean, they just think of that. When you start mixing humans, and we're sharing germs all the time, right? Just ask a parent, sends a little kid off to daycare. They all come back. I mean, germs spread very, very easily. So this is not good. 1918, all the conditions are there for a crazy mixed up batch of virus that the world had never seen before. This particular slide, you can tell that helmet is a French World War I helmet, and his cap is an officer's cap. So these are French people right behind the lines, and they're slaughtering, in this case, cattle to feed the troops. But they did stuff that ordinarily would be done under more sanitary conditions and whatnot. So the war is producing a lot of crazy things. So in 1918, the world is primed for and ready for something to happen. Population is on the move. You got soldiers, civilians, refugees. You couldn't get on an airplane. I challenged, no one took me up on this yesterday at noon, but I said anyone in the audience when I gave this talk yesterday at noon couldn't be anywhere in the world, probably except North Korea, in 24 hours if you already have a passport. And drive the Twin Cities, buy an airplane ticket, show your passport, you can go anywhere in the world. Now, in 1918, people didn't move like that. And so when new groups of people moved, it was shocking to the healthy, normal people, not normal, but resident people that were already there because new viruses, new bacteria were coming in. Today, we sort of take it for granted that you can move. The healthcare system was stretched to the limit. So many civilian doctors and nurses volunteered to go to the front. So your local doctor wasn't there. Food was rationed, so physically the civilian population isn't as healthy. People were near farm animals as never before. You had a large urban population that joined the army. They had never been around cows, horses, well maybe horses because they would still pull carts in cities, but they certainly weren't around chickens and stuff like that. The workload and stress on civilians made them more susceptible, and a biggie, censorship. We'll talk more about all this as we go on. So, 1916, though, we had some clues that something was up. There was an outbreak of what doctors called at the time purulent bronchitis. We had a fella listening, he's one of my former colleagues, I'm retired, he's still teaching, and I knew he'd been sick, and he came to the talk, and he had told me his doctors wanted to call it bronchitis and not the flu. And at this point I said, oh great, did they call it purulent bronchitis? Because in 1916, and this is all through John Oxford, this doctor I told you about, in this camp, an English military camp, Etaples, in France, there was a very unusual outbreak of something. So here's Etaples, here's England, right? Now, Dover to Calais is very short. That's always been the ferry route to take a boat, how you get there and everything. And right below Calais is Etaples, and it's a British military base with 100,000 soldiers coming and going. Some have been slightly wounded. They go there for a day or two and they go back to England to recuperate. New troops are coming from England. They go to Etaples, get more training, and then they're sent to the front. Here, Folkestone, that actually is where the channel goes under the channel and goes to there. So it's very, very close to England. So this Etaples is very, very important. Now we're in 1916, 2 years before the big outbreak. 100,000 men from all over the world. You had troops from Australia, well, England obviously, and Ireland, Scotland, Wales. You had Canada, troops from Australia, India, New Zealand, workers brought to dig the trenches and to do the dirt work. Remember, the empires are in full swing. And if you want another lecture on empires and racism and white supremacy, we can do that sometime. But they were bringing blacks and Indians, Caucasian, but very brown if you're from India, and using them basically as laborers, not treating them particularly very well. The troops were constantly on the move in and out of this camp. When Oxford started to study, did this purulent bronchitis have anything to do with the great influenza? The first thing he said is pigs. Were there any pigs? And he discovered there were 10 piggeries. Within these 100,000 men, there were 10 locations where they were bringing pigs from France and England and slaughtering them for the meat. There were thousands of chickens, ducks, geese, and turkeys for eggs and meat. In a military camp, we're not talking about a sanitary, we have a chicken plant or a turkey plant right here in Marshall, but we're talking about one in the open air. We're talking one where the guys next to them might be doing bayonet drill or something. We're not talking about necessarily the most sanitary conditions. Oh, wait, I did the wrong thing. Wait, go back. In 1917, when the United States enters the war, we use that camp. So our troop ships were going directly to France, but they were using this camp to get ready to go up to the front. So Etaples was something very, very unusual. Now, 1916, Excuse me. For those of you that have been going to all the World War I lectures, you already know, because we had a big lecture about Verdun and the Battle of the Somme. If I was a really nasty professor, I'd ask one of these high school kids in the back if they recognize either of those battles, but I'm going to skip that and just go right to it. I'm going to go back to the map. Verdun is right here. That's a signal for a fortress. There's the word Verdun. And actually, it's an absolutely useless spot of the battlefield. And the Germans picked it to attack because they knew the French had to defend it. So in February of 1916, they attacked this useless fort, knowing the French would defend it, and the battle went on until November. February to November. Practically 1 million men were killed, wounded, or are missing. If you go there now, there's a beautiful cemetery. White crosses all lined up, a few Star of Davids, but mostly it's white crosses all lined up. And you think there's a body under each cross, and there isn't. They never found most of the dead. Between the muddy battlefield and they fought for so long, the bodies decomposed, and they just made a graveyard. Thousands and thousands of people. Here is the River Somme, and right where the German lines hit the River Somme in July 1st of 1916, the British started the Battle of the Somme with some help from the French. The Americans are not there yet. 55,000 British soldiers died the first day of that battle. If you ever go to DC and you go to the Vietnam Memorial, there's 56 or 57,000 names, it might be 58,000 Americans died in Vietnam over a 14-year period, to give you just an inkling of what this war was like. Machine guns, never used before, high-powered artillery that you could fire 6 shells a minute, poison gas, barbed wire, and they were just slaughtering people, okay? So, between the Allies, meaning the French and the British and all their collected people, and the Germans, close to 2 million casualties just at these two battles. In the summer, you had about 100 men that died of purulent bronchitis. So you can understand why it didn't really crop up on anybody's attention like, holy smokes, we got something here that's killing healthy troops. Because the healthy troops were dying literally by their tens of thousands. So to lose 100 over a couple-week period, very unusually, just didn't set off all the alarm bells that you'd think, looking back, you go, wow, why didn't they notice this? People were dying and they had cyanosis, which is a blue discoloration of your skin, which people get like if they've almost drowned and they get rescued because the oxygen is cut off. And so your skin starts to turn blue from lack of oxygen. Well, these men, young, healthy men, not wounded, were within hours, 24 hours, their lungs were filling with fluid, hence bronchitis, and that was cutting off their oxygen. And so they got this cyanosis. A relatively small number died, and then it backed off. It disappeared. So Lancet is the famous British medical journal, and 3 articles were published. Now remember, there's censorship, but not too many people are going to be thumbing through medical journals. So 3 articles were published in 1916 and 1917 about what they call purulent bronchitis and its cyanosis. One of them, July 14th, 1917. It's quickly forgotten. There's censorship, so nobody's talking about it. They obviously don't want to talk about it because they want to keep the morale up. And like I said, there were very few deaths overall, so it didn't really concern anybody. It wasn't a blip. But the cyanosis and the bronchitis were identical to the 1918 influenza. So this John Oxford that I've been mentioning, there's a big controversy today. He is convinced that this is the same virus. The American research team, because they're still looking for this virus, the American research team says, I want to see a slide from 1916 under a microscope and a slide from 1918 and compare them, and then I'll say the same thing. And Oxford's pulling his hair out going, what do you want? You got all the symptoms. You got everything identical. You can't see it in a microscope anyway, and you want to... He's going, no, somehow or another, it started in 1916 and it disappeared. That's Oxford's. Now, in the spring of 1918, it hits big time. This is a military camp in the United States. These were young, healthy... You couldn't get into the Army if you were sick, if you had tuberculosis, you had any kind of heart disease, you had to have so many teeth. The multiple choice test was invented to screen American troops, so they took the, kind of deviants and mentally unfit out of the pool. That's where the multiple choice test comes from, is to screen people who weren't ready to go to the front. We'll leave the irony of that out. But anyway, here they all are sick. Not all of them are going to die, but now in all probability in 1918, the great influenza started in roughly 3 locations at once. This says Aldershot, which is a main military base, still is, in the UK, meaning in England, and then Etaples, which I've already talked about on the coast of France. And then in this province in China, talk about China in a bit again more later, but the way the Chinese keep their chicken and their poultry, they have huge open air markets, and Chinese shoppers don't go to Hy-Vee and buy a chicken that many people think was probably somehow concocted in the back room of Hy-Vee. It never had feathers, it just kind of grew wrapped in cellophane, and there it is. They want to see their chicken, so they go where the chicken is alive and they watch it being butchered. Okay, so there's a lot of live chickens around a lot of live people, and you know from earlier in this talk, or from a good biology course that you've already taken, that chickens and humans can spread viruses, share viruses. And China's, one of the big influenza is called the Hong Kong flu for a reason. So they got an outbreak in 1917, very similar to the purulent bronchitis. And then Camp Fulton, and there should also be listed a camp right outside Boston, but I didn't make this slide. So Camp Fulton's in Kansas. They were slaughtering pigs near there, and then suddenly in the middle of summer, young, healthy men were getting very, very sick. Same thing outside Boston. Some of them were getting so sick they were dead in 12 hours. Think of that. You get what seems to be a cough and a high fever, and you hurt like hell, and you're drowning in your own bodily fluids and dead within 12 hours. It just is stunningly shocking to the medical community. They just don't know what's going on. So they did not have good color photography. They had rudimentary x-rays and things like that. But what they did was, with the autopsy, they would have artists draw. That's a lung that should look healthier. It's very red from the infection and blood vessels bursting and things like that. Very often it would also be very blue because the oxygen had been cut off. And very often they're very, very filled with fluids. When your lungs fill with fluids, you cough, and healthy lungs are not filled with fluids. So this was made of an American who died somewhere in the United States, and all that information is down there, American soldier. So the post-mortem and the autopsy reports, how are we doing? Oh, great. Post-mortem, the disease spread quickly and easily. The wrong age, as I said, is dying. It's young, healthy men, some women, mostly age 20, in the military. In the regular general population, it's men and women of equal proportions. 20 to 40 was hit the hardest. It brought on pneumonia and bronchitis, bloody fluid into the lungs. You got secondary infections from that. So many people were dying from a bacterial infection brought on by this virus, creating a situation that an opportunistic bacteria could spread very, very quickly. A very high infection and mortality rate. It's the wrong time of the year. You can get the influenza any time of the year. you can get influenza. But it happened, the two big bursts are in the summer and the autumn. I've got some charts I'll show you in a minute. This is the one that's stunning. I've read this in 2 or 3 different places. October 1918, that month, still rates as the highest mortality rate of Americans in our history. Not 1863 with Gettysburg, not some battle during World War II, but October 1918, because that is the height of the pandemic in the United States. And it rates as more Americans died in that month than any other month in our history so far. Now, when the influenza hits in the United States, and it's hitting all over the world at this point, William Henry Welsh was a leading researcher and infectious disease expert. He had helped with the discovery of yellow fever at the Panama, and they came up with a vaccine for that. Yellow fever, I believe, is a bacteria. He travels from Washington, because he's at the big Washington, center of government. He goes up to this Camp Devens near Boston. Camp built for 35,000, there's 45,000 troops. Base hospital has room for 2,000, they have 8,000 patients. 60 are dying per day. He gets up there and he performs the first autopsy. And autopsies, which, not to be too crude, but you cut open a cadaver. He cuts open this young man, about 20 years old, had been perfectly healthy a few days before, who is dead. He has these blue swollen lungs filled with bloody fluid. And he says to the people around in the little theater where they do this, this must be some kind of new infection or plague. They had never seen anything like this. And this is happening all over the place. Well, we're at war with Germany. If you got German ancestries, you probably don't want to spread this around too much. Fought 2 big wars with Germany. But we blame the Germans for everything. All you got to do is look at the paper today, and if you look at papers coming from a certain political persuasion, it's all Muslim, Islam, they're the fault of everything no matter what. Well, that's kind of what was going on in the war hysteria. They were convinced that somehow the Germans did this. They were convinced. There were rumors that U-boats, which were very deadly, U-boats are what brought us into World War I, and they would surface and spread clouds over Boston that were spreading it. And of course that's not true, but that's what they thought. Everyone was using poison gas. There's another lecture, by the way, chlorine gas. You ever gone to a swimming pool and there's that room off to the side of the swimming pool and it says chlorine, do not enter, they made, that's to keep the water pure so you can swim, all of us can swim, but they were making a weapon with that. And if there's ever an accident at a swimming pool, they tell everybody to get out of the way, don't breathe, get away, get away. Well, that's because it's poisonous. Well, anyway, the Allies were convinced that the Germans and the Allies used poison gas too, both sides used it, but that the Germans had made some kind of poison gas that was creating the influenza. Because the Germans are not telling, they had the influenza too, but they weren't telling anybody. It's censorship, right? And so the high command knew that it was in our trenches facing the Germans, didn't know that the Germans were getting sick at the same rate, so they thought the Germans had started this. Aspirin, just your common daily aspirin, was developed by a German company, Bayer, and they were convinced that somehow the Germans had poisoned aspirin, which was our only pain reliever and our only medicine for reducing fever. So when you got the influenza, what did you take? Aspirin. Yeah, because there's no ibuprofen, there's no acetaminophen, so it's just crazy, crazy, crazy times. Now, in the summer, everybody's sick all around the world, summer of 1918. You're getting more history than you planned here. Where's my map? This doesn't show, but if we had a big enough map, over here is Russia. It wasn't the Soviet Union yet. And Germany is right between, and they were fighting the Russians, and they were fighting this way. So they had to divide their army. And in 1917, they made a peace agreement with the Russians, because then that became the Soviet Union. So they were able to rush half of their army to the west. So suddenly, Along this line here, the Germans had basically twice as many troops, and they almost won the war. Now, by that time, the United States was in the war, and they were able to send troops that almost made up for that balance of power. But when the Germans were breaking through, they started to get the influenza. And so, but the United States was told, please hurry up, send more troops, send more troops. But the U.S. knew if we send the troops on a ship, 30% of them are going to be sick by the time they get to France. And a large number of them are going to die before they get to France. And it came to the president, Woodrow Wilson, who had to make a decision. And he made the decision to send the troops, even though he knew many of them were going to die on the way or be sick on the way. And the rumor goes, the little apocryphal story, we're not sure it's true, but so the story goes, that when he signed the order, he sat at the desk in the Oval Office and hummed to himself, I had a bird named Enza. I opened up the window and in flew. It's not the quite words. I had a little bird. Its name was Enza. I opened up the window and in flew Enza. This is the President of the United States mumbling this kid's song. I mean, that's how prevalent that little song was. Anyway, huge, huge influence on the war. Workers are too sick to work. In some countries, in the United States, 25% of the population got sick at one time or another over this 12 or 14-month period. The strain on the civilian population hurts morale. Soldiers are too sick to fight at the front. In part, that's what stopped the German offensive in the spring and summer of 1918, where they got all these troops fighting the Russians that they rushed them over. The other thing was, if you know anything about the trench warfare, it's really like a 20 to 40 mile strip where all the fighting is taking place along this thing. And if you got beyond that into France, you had wineries, you had cheese, you had, fresh meat. And when the Germans got in there, when they really pushed into France for the first time since 1914, the troops went nuts. I mean, they were going into the wine cellars, they were eating cheese, they were drinking wines. I'm sure they were chasing French women. And so partly the army went on a big drunk, and that kind of slowed them down. But a lot of them had the flu, too. The Americans were getting to the front, and they were getting sick, as I said. This does not reproduce very well, because I picked the background before I found the slide. World War I, right? The flu spreads quickly. Wherever people were traveling. The stress made it worse. Modern transportation made it worse. You can't read this. I'll just highlight it. 675,000 Americans died of the flu in this 14-month, 16-month period, mostly in second half of 1918. But 57,000 soldiers died of the influenza, which is 4,000 more than were killed in combat. 53,000 Americans died in combat. 57,000 died from the influenza. It just gives you an idea. A total of about 25% of the population of the United States got the influenza. One form or not all of them died. So why should we not call it the Spanish flu? Spain was neutral. And Spain's newspapers did what they were supposed to do when they reported what was going on. Spain had a huge outbreak of the influenza. They put it in the newspaper. The king got very sick. He lived, but he got very sick. That was in the newspaper. They think 1/3 of Spain got sick. That's a lot of people sick at one time or another. US and Europe had censorship, so they couldn't put in the newspaper that dock workers and factory workers were getting sick with the influenza. And so they started calling it the Spanish flu. That's how, I'll tell you why I knew a lot about this when I was growing up, but we always called it the Spanish flu, but we'll find out later. Here's the mortality rate. Now, again, this is UK, but you see this is 629. So the end of June to the end of July, look at the mortality rate pop up there. This is kind of the average mortality rate, right? Just kind of, people get old and they're sick, there's accidents. Look at this is early October, whoop, whoop, to the middle 2-month period. Look at that. From average of about 1 to 2 per whatever that is, to 25 It's a huge increase. And then a third wave later in the spring of 1919. Here's the U.S. death rate. The red is 1918. Not all of these deaths are the influenza, but this is the black are the 6 years before 1918, and the red is 1918. And you see March, April, kind of boom, and there's October. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. This is life expectancy in the United States from 1900 to 1960. You see overall it goes up, but you see 1918, that huge dip. Huge dip. Now, partly that is mortality caused by the war, but remember, more soldiers died of the influenza than died fighting of the war. If the influenza hadn't hit, there might have been a little bit of dip, but 53,000 in a population, what was the population of America then? 100 million? Probably wouldn't have noticed it so much. So, current estimates 100 million. I'm going to tell you why I got to 100 million, and other people as well. 20% of the population was infected. They say 20 to 40 million died, but that's way, way low. It struck mostly, as I said earlier, 20-year-olds to 40-year-olds. 675,000 Americans died. It says 43,000 soldiers, but we know that number is higher. Here's the last two major influenza outbreaks, 57, 58, 68, 69. Here's 1918, 19, and again, they say 40, but it should go way up. And this was put out at after, and I forget what they called this one, if that's the swine flu or which one that is, but 2005 had a lot of people worried, as this year is too. Now, they didn't know how this thing worked, right? They had no idea. So panic. They closed, whoops, that's not the pointer. Go back. Always talk to mechanical devices. It works every time. So they closed the theaters, they closed the swimming pools, they closed schools, all kinds. Here's a boy selling newspapers, got his gauze mask. These are soldiers lined up doing some kind of gargling to protect them. Not going to work. They're all standing too close to each other and spitting. You know, that's probably spreading it more than... They banned Halloween. You know, you guys, 5 years ago, how would you have liked it if they banned Halloween? You know, you're 18, maybe you don't care now, but if you were 13, 12. So they banned Halloween. And again, here are soldiers. There's too many of them, so they line them up in a hallway. This is like a basketball court or something, and they lined them up. And not all of them would die, but many of them would get sick. This is Britain. They thought the gauze masks would help. This is Japan the next spring. In Asia, they still do wear the masks all the time. If you have a cough, it's considered courteous to wear the gauze mask. It doesn't do any good, but it's considered courteous. And of course, when it did make the newspapers, Le Monde, newspaper Le Monde, and here they are making fun. You can't see, but these are dancing people. These are dancing skeletons. And in Italy, I just laugh at this, of course, if you can read. They're blaming Spain, is what the gist of that cartoon is. The ultimate mortality, ultimate death, it had to come from Spain, it had to come somewhere. Here are mass graves. So many people dying in areas that they just had to resort to mass graves. I'll show you a few more in a minute. Here, a memorial for, it doesn't give the number, but a whole bunch of children died, and they have this, and it says, names are known only to God. Now, Rudyard Kipling, the poet, had one son, Jack was the son's name. There's a wonderful movie called My Boy Jack that's about the son going into the war. And Harry Potter, the actor who plays Harry Potter, plays Jack. It's a really, really well done, very sad. Bring your Kleenexes because it's a very sad movie, very powerful movie. After the war, they never found his body. He was killed in 1915. Kipling was already a personal friend of the kings in England. And so he was in part, made part of this commission to bury the nameless. There's, I would say millions is an exaggeration, but not by much, but thousands of people they didn't find all their remains, and they could identify them. And so he is the one, Kipling, that came up with this. Here lies, a British corporal whose name is known only to God. That little is a very British World War I expression on a grave. And so here they are for these children that died of the influenza. You can't read this, but this is in New Zealand. This is oh, don't you love the internet? You can get all these pictures. I've never been to New Zealand, but I got the picture. And we can't read it, but about 8,500 New Zealanders died of the influenza. In this particular area, 1,100 children were apparently buried. That, and there's a little memorial to them. You can't see this very well, but this is the death rate. And again, this says 50 million, but it's way off. India, 17 million, Japan, 390. And see, they have this big swing of a US, but it's really closer to this number and all the things here. And they aren't counting China and different things, so it's very difficult to really think of that as accurate. This is interesting because these countries were neutral, and these are the people that died of the influenza and what percent of the people who got the influenza died. So Spain, you can see why they call it the Spanish influenza. They shouldn't. But look at 250,000 people died in Spain. And again, it would have been in a 9, 10, 12-month period. So with that many people dying, you're going to know all about it. These are the countries that fighting was going on. And you can see Italy, which, like Spain, very poor. And look at the death rate. Hungary, also very poor. And look at the death rate. So just unbelievable. Now, again, calling it the Spanish influenza, and again calling it 50 million. But they didn't count China, and they didn't count what by after 1920 or so was the Soviet Union. And they didn't count large numbers South Africa, and because I hate to be the guy that sounds like this, but white guys were doing the counting, and so there were some people in the world that really didn't count. If you were Asian, if you were black, and it really was closer to 100 million people, because it's like they weren't counting all, and they didn't have the means of counting in rural China where whole villages were being decimated. And so it probably is better to, as horrible as it is, it's better to think of this number as closer to 100 million people rather than 50. And of course, we're never going to say Spanish flu. Well, of course, you get anything and you get quacks out there and whatever. Horlicks malted milk. Come and drink it. And Milton, who's a good poet, but he doesn't make whatever. Here's my particular favorite. Eat more onions. Now, I'm Italian. I know it's garlic. Eat garlic. And I love if you can get up here and read it. Bring your own sacks. Will be sold direct from car. Can you imagine thrifty whites selling you medicine from the back of their car? Very reputable. And of course, this is why this is important. This is today, 2018. Oh, 2018, not 19. This is a inoculation needle from roughly this period. You've seen this slide before. And the anti-vaxxers out there, 50 million dead from the influenza, from the flu vaccine. There was no flu vaccine. And I just can't believe when I see stuff on the internet and Facebook about not getting a vaccine because it's going to give you some this or this or this. It's like, are you kidding me? And so they're using kind of, people sort of know this happened. They don't really know the history. And then they're saying, because they could not produce a flu vaccine because they didn't know it was a virus. And they're saying that's what killed people. And then my favorite, during the outbreak, again, they call it Spanish flu, 500 million people across the world were infected. That's pretty accurate, probably more than that. But those that worked in cinnamon factories were immune. So cinnamon and garlic, what they're saying is go to the Hunan and get a really spicy dinner and you're going to be... There's our little buddy. So why worry? All right, this is the part of the talk that will make you more upset than what happened 100 years ago. The avian flu, N5N1. Why do we care? It spreads among birds quickly and across countries. It jumps host, namely to animal groups. And remember, I know not everybody likes to hear this, but we're mammals. You know, have a lot in common with horses, chimpanzees, cows, and this stuff can jump very easily. The percentage, this last one in 2006, 184 confirmed cases and 103 died. You see what percentage of deaths that is? That's what, 70%, 60%? Wow, that's really bad. And of course, they can mutate very, very quickly. This just happened recently in China, where they had to kill millions of chickens because the chickens were infected with something. And remember, they do a lot of their slaughtering of their chickens in open air right in front of people. This is France, and if you've ever been to France, I mean, not one that's got influenza, but the French know how to cook duck, you know, the grease, and oh, it's great with your little froid, whatever that is. Anyway, I had a nice dinner. I shouldn't be talking about all this food. But this is happening recently, and of course, this is happening in Minnesota. You recognize CARE 11? That's us, right? Thousands and thousands of birds. This is just a couple counties away where they had, and then they buried them. The avian flu close to home, and no wild birds were detected. They kept saying, this is coming from somewhere, and then the DNR and the health people would go out and find all these wild birds, and they had no avian flu, which means it was spread farm to farm to farm. Not because birds were flying over and droppings were getting in the food supply, which is what they first said. You know, oh, birds flew over and crapped on the corn. And no, it didn't happen. So remember, turkeys are not here. They're missing, but all these avian things, all these pigs, this should be an arrow here, and us. And once you get this thing whipping, it's not good. It's not good. And in case you need a reminder, we are the third largest swine producers in America. Iowa, right down the road, is number one, then North Carolina. 750 million hogs in Minnesota, which is almost twice the population. It's almost 2 hogs for every person. We have 11% of the population, a total of the hogs in America, and it's growing. It's the fastest growing. And, you know, I get a little political when I talk, but I'm not a real big fan of factory farms because all of these animals are being fed huge doses of antibiotics. Antibiotics do not affect a virus, but they keep secondary infections, bacterial infections, from killing off the herd. The problem is we eat that pork, we eat that chicken, we eat those eggs, and our system absorbs a little bit of the antibiotic. And we know, and you can go on the internet and read all about this, that antibiotics are less effective today in 2018 because of the overuse, mostly in agriculture, of antibiotics. And part of that is because we're cramming so many animals, and if you are in this industry, my apologies, but it's just simply not good. This is a terrible flu season, as I said. This is a headline from, they called it the Aussie flu, but this is how sick England was, the UK recently. So, please don't call it the Aussie flu or the Spanish flu. Now, people ask me, why am I so interested in this? And part of the reason is, this is my grandfather. And this is the date that the month, this says 1918. Notice they conveniently misspelled his name, Zarzano, not Zarzana. This is his brother. Now, George Zarzana, my grandfather, came from Sicily in 1913, came through Ellis Island. My grandmother and he were from the same village. They'd agreed to meet in Sacramento because they both had relatives in Sacramento. They did not stay on the East Coast, which is very unusual. Most Italians stayed on the East Coast. They came right to Sacramento. They got married. My father was born in 1914. My aunt was born 2 years later. And my grandfather died in 1918. A couple days later, his brother, who was from LA, who had come up to visit and came with his son, so his nephew got the influenza and died as well. And then the nephew died. So my grandfather, my great uncle, and then what would be a cousin once removed or something like that, all died within a 5 or 6 day period, and they're buried in pauper graves in Sacramento. My aunt was very sick with what they thought was the influenza. The doctor, she was 2, the doctors told my grandmother she's going to die. And my grandmother said, if she's going to die, I'm going to take her home. So she took her out of the hospital, and she recovered and lived to be 95, and as did my grandmother. So I hope I have those genes. And but they said, I mean, we heard these stories, growing up, and they said if she hadn't been taken out of the hospital, she probably would have died, because there were so many viruses and so many secondary infections floating around the hospitals that she probably, because she was sick, picked something up that would have killed her. But in fact, she recovered. Her father didn't. My grandmother married a second time, and the man that I always knew as my uncle was really like my father's half-brother. Was just never thought of it that way until, you did a genealogy chart and you go, oh, that's not a direct line. So there's my grandfather, and right next to him is this fella. It's a pauper's grave. St. Mary's. As I often tease my wife, who's a Murphy, these Italian guys were thrown into the ground by some Irish gravedigger at St. Mary's, so they didn't bother to spell the name right. And that's how close my uncle is, my great uncle. I mean, they talk about cheek by jowl. They just kind of slapped him in there. And here in Marshall, Jennifer Andrews sent me this when she found out I was going to do this talk. The forerunner of the Marshall Independent, and what was it called back then? You know what it was called? It was like the Marshall newspaper, the Messenger. Yeah, and so it says no deaths for the past 2 days, but like there were 12 deaths during a week of influenza, So probably a half or a third the population in the county back then, and then, that's quite a few deaths. It was most of this family apparently died. Well, I have a bibliography. There's 2 books. This is John Barry's. This is like the Bible of the great influenza. It's 2005. You have a copy, right? Yeah, I saw. And most of my history is out of this. Very thorough, very interesting, and you can take a look at that. This one is a little different. It's called Flu. Let me just read you the subtitle. The Story of the Great Influenza Pandemic of 1918 and the Search for the Virus that Caused it. This was published in 1999, and it was about the 1990s, where they were trying to find cadavers in permafrost of people that died of the influenza. They were fairly certain they died of the influenza, so they could find that virus. And all of the kind of scientific infighting. For those of you familiar with the AIDS virus and the search the band played on, I think is the name of that book, and it's like faculty members. The infighting, they're all supposed to be happy-go-lucky intellectual scientists looking for the truth, and they're like backstabbing. I want to find the first, that's my Nobel Prize. And there's some interesting stories in here. Personally, I found the Barry's book just easier to read and more insightful. And this is, I don't want to say gossipy, but if you're going to read the 2 of them, I would read this first, and this one will give you some things. So if you go to www.james.a.zarzana, you go to James Zarzana or James A. Zarzana, I bought both names, and then go to the miscellany. I have a bibliography, and I've got a few sheets. I don't have enough for all of you, but you can print your own if you go to that address. It's got both books listed there. And if you go to YouTube, and if you go from there, it's hot linked. You can just point and click and it takes you right to it. But there's some wonderful documentaries. There's one called Secrets of the Dead, Killer Flu, and that's where the John Oxford is interviewed, and a lot of the purulent bronchitis is talked about, and how he's digging up the grave of these 1916 soldiers and trying to find evidence of what they had and everything. Then it just aired recently on PBS, and our library, the campus library, has a copy of it on DVD, but you can watch it on YouTube. American Experience Influenza 1918. And that's about the American experience and, you know, schools closing and things like that. And it's really touching. It's really well done. It's an older one, and they kind of updated it a little bit because they were interviewing people who were in their 80s who were young children in 1918. So clearly that was made 15 or 20 years ago that they could have interviewed these people. But this one little older gentleman tells the story of when he was 5 and they closed his school. And then when school reopened, he went to look for all his friends and they weren't there. You know, they had been taken in the influenza. Then in the year 2000, I just love what gets put up. You know, if you can find good stuff on the internet. This, Gina Colada is the author of this book, and there's an hour interview of her that was made in the year 2000, which is just fascinating. You know, it's grainy, it's not very well, you know, because the technology 20 years ago. But it's very interesting. She talks about the book, and she talks about looking for these cadavers. I mean, they're digging up people and, you know, islands up in the Arctic Circle above Norway where they thought these fishermen had died and buried up there, and they're going to find their lungs and all this sort of stuff. So, and she's a very interesting. So I've got a paper copy and I've got this kind of copy. And I do have cards if you want to buy my books. Never pass up an opportunity to advertise. Any questions or issues? Yes?
Jim, I'm curious. You mentioned, I'm curious about the medical treatment. I noticed you said they had aspirin. They talked about that. But if all these people are dying, what were the doctors trying? They must have been trying other things. Do you know what else they were trying?
Specifically, I don't know. Well, you saw the fake stuff. I think they were just trying to keep them helpful, and I'm sure they thought whatever medicines at the day, you know, that probably weren't effective, but they were administering them. I don't know if they gave them like morphine or something to ease the pain. You know, I really don't know. And if I read anything about that, I wouldn't have paid much. But yeah, given the medical community of the day, there wouldn't have been much. I mean, the sanitation isn't much. You know, you see them with the gauze mask, but their nose is, you know, gauze mask just over their mouth, you know. So it was painful. And I think it was the shock that nothing like this had happened before. And I meant to mention this. One theory is, since all of us get some form of the influenza, all of us get sick one form or another, and so our bodies are kind of have some kind of immune, or they're already kind of remember this and they know how to fight it kind of thing, that the people born around 1880 through like 1900, 1905, there weren't any big influenzas in the way that we're getting a yearly influenza. And they think that group of people who would have been in their 20s and 30s in 1918 had never had any type of influenza. And so that kind of made it. And I was talking to Vince Laporte, Dr. Laporte, many of you know Dr. Laporte, and he says one theory is that when people got sick, their own bodies like panicked. They go, wow, you're really sick. So they like did everything to fight it. And that's why the infections broke out in the lungs, because they sent, we're going to kill this thing with this and this and this, and then all kind of your body overloaded on fighting it, and that's where all the fluid got in there. So it's a lot of things. But I don't think they could do much but quarantine and whatever. If you're also into fiction, like reading, besides my books, Catherine Ann Porter's Pale Horse, Pale Rider is a fictional piece based on her real life. And one of the documentaries I mentioned talks about her quite a bit. And the man that took care of her, she survived, and then he got sick and died. He was a young soldier. They were engaged, I believe. Yes, Jan?
Maybe a little bit related to this last question. And if you don't know the answer to this question, it would be understandable. But in your research, did you find something that indicated what made it wane? What made it disappear? I mean, if it peaked in October, November of 1918, it starts diminishing by December, January. You get into 1919, and it's like it's gone.
Yeah.
So
well, I think John Ireland, Oxford, says it best. Viruses exist to find a host, to replicate, and to die. And the way he described it in one of the documentaries, it just basically got into everybody in one form or another. It either made them very sick and they died, or it made them sick enough that they got sick and they recovered, or it only made them slightly sick. But the viruses did not find huge numbers of people anymore, that particular virus. And then, of course, the virus is mutating all the time anyway. And so it mutated into a less deadly form, or a form that couldn't spread as easily. But his theory is, if I'm reading his remarks correctly, that it basically had infected so many people that it couldn't find new people, and therefore it couldn't replicate. And his interview, because his interview was made about 10 years ago, and when I put his little biography up there, it did say he's also an authority on HIV/AIDS, and he said if we get another pandemic like that, it's all the people with weakened immune systems that are going to go first. And he said the AIDS community, tuberculosis, because he said they're just ripe for something this deadly because they're already, have such a suppressed immunity system. I mean, I would not want to be online for a transplant, a knee or something at a time, where they have to suppress your immune system when this thing breaks, because they're like setting it up to, you may as well hold out a sign, I'm a Motel 6, come on over, yeah, Heidi?
Was there anything that said like the downstream effects, those that recovered, did they have lasting effects, physical?
I think more emotional. I mean, if my family's any indication, they talked about it. Every time we got together, we talked about the influenza.
I know my grandfather had pneumonia and his lungs were never the same.
Right. I'm sure a lot, there were some mention of that, and I can't point to a lot. But yeah, if you had been that sick, especially if you were 20, I think it would have probably weakened your heart and weakened, yeah. But I don't have anything more specific than that. But yes, sir.
I heard some figures. How many people died in World War II?
World War One.
Million?
World War I. This is all happening during World War I. It's about 5 million.
But I heard World War II is 70 million. Is that right?
50, certainly 50 million, 55. 70 seems a little high, but they don't count. Again, they're not counting like all the Chinese that would have died due to privation, because you had the communists and the nationalist Chinese fighting over the Chinese to fight the Japanese. So how many civilians are dying, and are they counting them? But certainly 50 million people died in World War II, and many of them civilians, not all of them combatants. Yeah.
So this is way worse than World War II, and they said that was the most horrendous thing ever.
Yeah. Well, most horrendous war, certainly. Yeah.
And this ended up being way more than that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just another influenza.
Just the influenza. Yeah. Again, I grew up in the Cold War, and the Russians were bad. Remember that, when the Russians were the bad guys and you weren't supposed to take money from them? Imagine that. But 20 million Russian civilians died, thank you to the way Hitler wanted to fight that war, where he didn't care if he killed Russian civilians after he conquered them. And so the numbers, many more soldiers died, but in World War II, the number of civilians, because they were indiscriminately killed in a way that you couldn't do it in World War I, because if they were near the front, they got evacuated. You see these pictures of some of these French cities that are all rubble in World War I. That's German artillery, and you see cities like that in World War II. That's aerial bombing. And there's film after the war flying over a German city, and it's block after block after block of destruction. That was the U.S. Air Corps, as it was called back then, and British Lancasters going over thousands at a time. You didn't have anything like that in World War II, World War I, Thank you. Other questions? What about from the high school? You guys must ask some questions. It's great seeing you here, by the way, guys. I haven't taught, you're not in high school, but
With the high schoolers.
yeah.
Early on in the slides, you had one where you had the dotted line was was the normal death rate.
Right.
And then you had
The U,
line.
and then
You know, there was a lot of youth and a lot of older, but there was a big spike in the middle. Like
That's
30.
1980.
Why?
well, that's what they don't know. That why this thing hit principally 20 to 40-year-olds. That's part of what they don't know. My grandfather was 28, so he's right in that spike. Yes?
Wouldn't it have hit them and affected them because they hadn't had a flu epidemic before? Like they didn't have an immunity to it? That's why.
Right. They did not, in all likelihood, that age group did not have an immunity or any bodily knowledge of an influenza of that severity that they got when they were 8 or 10. And so when it hit them when they're 28, they were just wide open to it. I mean, when you know, we get our smallpox and we get our polio, you are basically given the disease. So your body builds up an immunity. And so obviously under controlled circumstances, and they're actually quite good for us, thank you very much. But if you had a generation that did not have anything like that, so that's one theory. The other theory is that this virus just mutated into something so horrific, and we can't study it because we don't know what it is, and it could happen again. That it doesn't matter if you were sick when you were a kid.
That could have been from like American Indians that don't have any buildup.
Right, right. And this hit the Native American community and a lot of African communities very severely because of their burial rituals. Like the Native Americans will sit with the body for 24 hours. Well, that body is highly contagious, either of what killed them or other bacterial infections, and the whole community. And so, like parts of Nebraska and Kansas where there were still natives living in larger numbers on reservations, the reservations had 60-70% mortality rate, and the people living in the communities had, you know, your average 10 or 14%. I mean, it was huge discrepancy between the native populations, and not just in the United States and Canada, but in Africa, Polynesia, and a lot of it has to do with how long they kept the body before the body was buried.
They haven't built an immunity either.
Right, and they had less immunity. Yeah. Anything else? You've been a very, don't move until I count you. You've been a very good audience. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, 35, 36, 37, 38, 39, 40, 41, 42, 43, 44, 45, 46, 47, 48, 49, 50, 51, 52, 53, 54, 55, 56, 57, 58. And for those of you that were here earlier, Mary Ann's yesterday was 35. She gave a very, oh, yeah, anything Mary Ann does is wonderful. So I'm a little smitten, what can I say? Well, thank you so much. If you want to talk, thank you.